If you found out about the affair, could you stop? Or would the desire to know more take over, as it did with me? The screen flickered in front of Michael, casting a soft blue light across the darkened room. His heart beat steadily, but his mind was a whirlwind of emotions he could hardly contain. On the screen, Sarah and Jack were together in the dimly lit hotel room, their movements slow, deliberate, as if time itself had slowed down for them. Jack reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair away from Sarah's face. The touch was tender, intimate in a way that Michael hadn't seen between them in years. His fingers trailed down her neck, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, and Sarah, as if responding to some unseen force, leaned into him. Her eyes fluttered shut, and Michael could see the subtle shift in her body not from cold, but from anticipation and pleasure. Jack slowly leaned in toward her lips, their breaths mingling, and at that moment, there wasn't a shred of doubt between them. Sarah responded to his kiss with a passion that Michael hadn't felt from her in years. She pressed herself closer to Jack, her hands gently sliding across his shoulders, and every gesture, every breath seemed so natural, so genuine. She trembled under his touch, as if this was her only moment of true freedom and joy. Michael sat motionless, unable to tear his eyes away from the screen. He saw how Sarah savored every moment, how her face glowed with emotion. She looked different more alive, more open. In those moments when she touched Jack, it seemed as if the world around her disappeared. Michael knew he should feel pain, jealousy, but something darker pierced through him a strange satisfaction from witnessing this, from being a spectator of her happiness that he could no longer give her. He saw how Jack's hands gently caressed her body, how Sarah responded to his every touch, how her body arched in response to his movements. Her smile, the soft laughter, the whispers all of it seemed so real, so far from the Sarah he knew at home. It hurt, but at the same time it was mesmerizing. Michael was like a prisoner of his own emotions, frozen before the screen, unable to stop the flood of feelings that washed over him. Michael sat as if chained to the screen, unable to look away. Everything inside him screamed that this was wrong, that he should get up right now, clench his fists and rush over there, confront them, expose Sarah, demand a divorce, accuse her of betrayal. Logic dictated that this was the natural course of action. Any husband in his place would have done exactly that. But Michael couldn't move. His body, mind, emotions all seemed paralyzed before the screen. He couldn't tear himself away, and there was something painfully beautiful in it. He watched as Jack gently touched Sarah, how his hands glided over her body, how Sarah gave herself to those touches, how her face filled with an expression of pleasure that Michael hadn't seen in years. Every movement Jack made, every response from Sarah seemed to captivate him. They looked beautiful, almost perfect. Sarah, whom he knew as his wife, appeared before him in a completely new light as a woman capable of emotions and passion he hadn't felt in a long time. Her face, her body, her movements they all seemed so alive, so real. His mind contradicted itself. This was pain, sharp and cutting, from the realization that this was happening to his wife, to the woman he had once loved. But at the same time deep down, on some strange, unfamiliar level he liked it. This feeling was so foreign, so new, that he couldn't understand what was happening to him. It was as if he had become a witness to a secret, forbidden moment, and the thrill of it was something he couldn't control. He should have stopped. Logic demanded that he close the laptop, break all connections, and destroy this evidence of betrayal. But his emotions wouldn't let him. There was a strange magnetism in this, something more than just the shock of betrayal. It was almost like aesthetic pleasure. He was watching this as something beautiful, sensual, almost like art. How she moved in Jack's hands, how her body arched, how her lips touched his skin, how her breath quickened with each kiss. This was just the prologue, a glimpse into the moments that would forever change the course of my life, leaving me entangled in a web of emotions I couldn't untangle. But this is only the beginning. What happened? How I found myself standing on the edge of the unknown, watching what no husband should ever witness. I'll tell you everything from the start. Every small sign, every doubt that turned into a revelation, and every moment that led me to this point there. This is the story of how it all began. And as you follow along, Juve LLC, just as I did, how the lines between love, obsession, and something darker began to blur. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his face illuminated by the glow of his laptop. Outside, the bright California sun was just beginning to break through the sheer curtains. The house was quiet where his wife, Sarah, had left for work an hour ago, and the kids were at school. It was a typical morning for their all-American family. A spacious suburban home, a perfectly manicured lawn, and two SUVs parked in the driveway. Michael had always been proud of how far they had come. Just ordinary kids from middle-class backgrounds, they had achieved the American dream. Their own property, successful careers. Sarah was a sales manager at a large company, and he worked in cybersecurity. But behind this image of suburban bliss lay a growing sense of routine fatigue, something they rarely spoke about. He thought again about how their life had become predictable. Work from morning till night, weekends spent with neighbors at barbecues or attending the kids' soccer games. Everything ran like clockwork, and he could feel their relationship slowly withering away. The spark that once connected them was no longer there. Michael placed his coffee cup on the table and ran a hand over his short-cropped hair. It used to be thicker, like Jack's Vey, their neighbor from across the street. But that was a long time ago. Now he didn't look as young and fresh as he had 10 years ago. His thoughts often drifted to Sarah and how she had changed too. She spent more and more time at work, came home later than usual, and often turned down their plans with the excuse of being too tired. His cybersecurity instincts told him something was wrong. But on the other hand, it could just be his imagination, paranoia that he often noticed in his line of work. Michael glanced at the laptop screen, where notifications from a client-verse security system were popping up. This was his world controlled, structured, full of order. Unlike what was starting to happen in his personal life. The day passed in its usual routine. Michael answered work emails, attended video calls with clients, and monitored security systems. But even during work tasks, his thoughts constantly returned to Sarah. Why had she left for work again without really saying goodbye? Why was she avoiding eye contact with him more and more? These small details held a much bigger problem, one he couldn't fully grasp yet. Late in the evening, when Sarah finally came home, Michael barely heard the sound of the door. He was sitting in the living room, pretending to watch TV. Sarah entered the room, bringing with her the chill of the autumn air. She looked tired, but there was something else in her eyes, something Michael couldn't recognize. Maybe it was just work fatigue, but at that moment Michael felt, for the first time, that he no longer knew her the way he once had. Michael felt something rising inside him, whether it was anger or fear, he couldn't tell. But once again, he didn't ask the question that had been bothering him. Why should he? He already knew the answer, he just feared saying it out loud. The evening passed as usual. Sarah went to bed earlier than Michael, citing exhaustion from the long day. She didn't want to talk, giving him only a brief kiss on the cheek before heading to the bedroom. Left alone in the kitchen, Michael stared at his half-empty coffee cup, trying to calm the growing tension. His thoughts about something being wrong were no longer just suspicions, they had become an obsession. He walked into his office, turned on the soft light of the desk lamp, and sat down at his computer. Everything was ready just a few hours ago. He had purchased and installed hidden cameras throughout their home, strategically placing them where Sarah might have her private conversations or meet someone. One camera overlooked the kitchen, another the bedroom. Michael knew this was crossing a line, but he couldn't stop himself. He opened the live feed from one of the cameras, freezing for a moment. Everything looked as expected. Sarah was asleep, nothing unusual. But inside, his emotions were spiraling. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly in control. He wasn't just suspecting or guessing now he had facts. But were they the facts he really wanted? Every sound, every step Sarah took in the house could now be heard or recorded. This new reality gave him a strange sense of power. It was more than just the need to know the truth. In his mind, a realization began to dawn. He wasn't just uncovering secrets. He was controlling them. He could monitor what she did, what she said, while staying invisible in the shadows. He switched to another camera, the one he had placed in Sarah's car. Over the past few weeks, she had been going out more often, claiming she had to work late. Michael couldn't help but wonder. What if these trips had nothing to do with work? It took him a few minutes to access the recorded footage. His heart pounded harder as he watched Sarah get into the car and drive off in the evening, right after she said she was going to visit a friend. His fear and doubt slowly gave way to another feeling. Pleasure? Pleasure from the fact that he was in control of the situation, though he didn't fully realize it yet. He was watching his wife as if she were an object, and with every passing minute, he was drawn deeper into this. What if I find out the truth? What then? Michael asked himself, but the answer didn't come. He only knew that he couldn't stop. The cameras had become his eyes and ears, helping him reclaim the control he thought he had lost. Days turned into weeks, and what had started as a simple act of curiosity became an obsession for Michael. Every day after Sarah left for work, he would sit in his office, watching the live feeds from the cameras, checking her movements, her phone calls, her emails. It was all too easy for someone like him. His career in cybersecurity had taught him how to gather information without being noticed. But the more he watched, the more he realized something was changing inside him. At first, he thought it was just the need for control, the desire to reclaim what he thought was slipping away. But now, as he sat in front of the screen, watching Sarah laugh on the phone with someone, a man whose voice he couldn't quite make out, he felt something different. The pain of betrayal that had once consumed him was now mixed with something else. Something he couldn't yet name. He didn't confront her. He could have. The evidence was there, recorded in the files on his computer, waiting for him to use. But each time he thought about exposing her, about confronting Sarah and her lover, he stopped himself. Instead, he felt a strange thrill as he watched her. As if by observing her secret life, he had found a new way to be part of it. Michael had never considered himself a voyeur. The idea of watching people without their knowledge had always seemed perverse to him. But now, sitting in his dimly lit office, with only the glow of the monitor illuminating his face, he couldn't deny the rush that came over him each time he hit play on one of the recordings. It was no longer just about the betrayal. It was about understanding, about witnessing something raw and private. He had never seen this side of Sarah before. The way she moved when she thought no one was watching, the way she smiled at her phone, the way her voice softened when she spoke to this other man. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time, and that realization both terrified and excited him. One evening, as he watched Sarah leave the house, saying she was going to meet her friend, Michael knew where she was really going. He had seen the messages, heard the phone calls. She wasn't going to meet a friend. She was meeting him, the man, her lover. Michael had every chance to follow her, to catch her in the act. But instead, he did something he hadn't expected. He sat back in his chair and let her go. He didn't need to follow her. He already knew what was happening. And strangely, he didn't feel the anger he thought he would. Instead, there was a quiet, unsettling calm that settled over him. As the door closed behind her, Michael stared at the screen, the live feed from the camera in the kitchen showing an empty room. He could hear his own breathing, slow and steady, as the minutes ticked by. He was in control. He could see everything, know everything, without ever having to confront it. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe that was enough. Michael no longer felt like a passive observer in his own life. The cameras he had installed were more than just tools for surveillance. They had become extensions of his own eyes, a way for him to live through Sarah's secret world without being physically present. He wasn't just watching, he was participating. And the more he watched, the more he realized that his emotions were far from what he had initially expected. Sitting in his office late at night, Michael replayed the footage from earlier in the day. Sarah had met her lover at a quiet CFG copyright on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the first time he had watched them together, but today was different. Today, instead of the usual wave of jealousy or anger, he felt something darker, something that unnerved him but also excited him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he watched them talk, their bodies leaning closer together, sharing whispers and soft touches, Michael's heart raced. But it wasn't just the pain of betrayal that made his pulse quicken. It was the strange sense of satisfaction that came with knowing that he was the unseen witness to their affair, that he had the power to observe them without being observed. It was intoxicating in a way he couldn't fully explain. He had never felt this before. The thrill of control, the power of voyeurism. It was new, unsettling, but undeniably addictive. And the more he watched, the more he craved it. The idea of confronting Sarah, of ending the charade, felt distant now, almost irrelevant. Why confront her when he could continue to watch, to know every detail of her secret life? It was as if by not acting, by not intervening, he had found a new way to control her. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small lamp on his desk. His breathing was shallow, his thoughts swirling in an endless loop of questions he didn't want to answer. What was happening to him? When had his pain turned into this strange pleasure? He thought back to when he first discovered the affair. The rage, the shock, the humiliation. It had all been so overwhelming. But now, that anger had faded into something more insidious. He no longer felt the need to expose Sarah or her lover. Instead, he found comfort in the routine of watching, in the quiet power that came with his secret knowledge. Michael stood up, walking over to the window that overlooked their backyard. The suburban streets were quiet, the neighbors' houses dark. It was late and everyone was asleep. Everyone but him. He could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him. But at the same time, there was a lightness, a freedom in the way he had embraced his new role. The man he had been a husband, a father, a provider felt distant now, like a character in a story he no longer wanted to play. The cameras, the surveillance, the watching it gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time. Control. But was it really control or just the illusion of it? He wasn't sure anymore. Sarah would never know the truth about what he had seen, what he knew. And that was perhaps the most powerful part of it all. The knowledge that he could watch, listen, and remain hidden. That he could be present in their lives without ever having to confront them. And as he stood there, staring out into the dark night, Michael couldn't help but wonder if this was who he had always been. Maybe, deep down, he had always craved this the quiet, invisible power of being the unseen observer. Michael's days had begun to blur together. Each morning, he woke up before Sarah, went through the motions of making coffee, checking emails, and pretending to live the life of a normal husband. But underneath the surface, everything had changed. His real life now existed in the hours spent alone in his office, in front of the glowing screens, watching his wife's every move. It was no longer just about knowing where she went or who she was with. It was about feeling something anything in the midst of the numbness that had overtaken him. The rush of watching her, the pulse of anticipation as she met her lover again and again, became the only thing that truly made him feel alive. One evening, as Michael sat in his office, he found himself clicking through old footage. He wasn't looking for anything specific just reliving moments, as if they were scenes from a movie. There was Sarah, walking through the house, talking on the phone. There she was, laughing with their kids at the dinner table. And then, there she was again with him her lover at that same CFG copyright where they met so often. The longer he watched, the more disconnected he felt from the life he used to live. It was as if he were no longer part of it. He was an outsider, a spectator. And yet, the strange satisfaction of being the one who knew everything, the one who held all the secrets, kept him coming back for more. That night, something shifted. As he watched Sarah and her lover in a dimly lit hotel room, Michael realized he no longer felt the urge to confront them. The anger, the betrayal, the desire to expose the affair It was all gone. In its place was something darker, something more primal. He was no longer just watching them because he had to know. He was watching them because he wanted to. His hand hovered over the keyboard, the temptation to rewind, to rewatch certain moments pulling at him. The way Sarah looked at her lover, the way she touched him there. These were things he had never seen her do with him. Not in years. And yet, instead of feeling hurt, Michael felt something else stir within him. Something that both terrified and thrilled him. He could end it. He could march into the bedroom right now, wake Sarah up, and confront her with the truth. He could shatter their marriage in an instant, and everything would be over. But as he sat there, staring at the screen, he knew that he wouldn't veti. He couldn't veti, because deep down a part of him didn't veti want it to end. The power he held over them over her was intoxicating. By not acting, by letting the affair continue, he was in control. And that control, however twisted, gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He didn't need to be the loving husband, the doting father. He didn't need to be anything but this an observer, an invisible force in their lives, knowing everything while revealing nothing. The realization hit him like a wave, both liberating and suffocating at the same time. He had become something else, someone else. And maybe, just maybe, this new version of himself was more honest than the man he had pretended to be for so long. As the night dragged on, Michael continued to watch, his mind racing. This was his life now, silent, hidden, but in control. He no longer needed the confrontation, the answers, or the truth. He had all the power he needed, sitting alone in the dark, watching the lives of others unfold before him. The moment Michael had dreaded and secretly longed for finally arrived one evening when he least expected it. Sarah had left the house earlier than usual, claiming she was meeting an old friend for drinks. But Michael knew better. He knew exactly where she was going, who she was meeting, and what they would be doing. He could picture it all in vivid detail, the way he had seen it unfold countless times before on the hidden cameras. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just a passive observer. He felt something growing inside him, a need to be closer to the truth, even if only from a distance. Without a second thought, Michael grabbed his jacket, left the house, and got into his car. He knew the hotel, the one they frequented. He had seen it on the footage. Now, for the first time, he would see it in person. As he drove through the quiet streets of their suburban neighborhood, the world outside seemed so ordinary, so calm. The same streets they had walked as a family, the same houses they had driven by on the way to the kids' soccer games. But inside Michael, there was nothing ordinary left. He had changed, evolved into something he barely recognized. When he arrived at the hotel, he parked a few blocks away, out of sight. His heart was pounding, but not from fear. It was excitement, anticipation. He knew exactly what was happening inside those walls. Sarah was with him, her lover. And for the first time, Michael was no longer content to watch from afar. He needed to be closer, to feel the rush of their proximity, even if they never saw him. He walked slowly toward the hotel, his mind racing. There was no plan, no confrontation in his mind. He wasn't here to stop anything. He wasn't here to break it all apart. He was here for one reason only, to observe, to experience the power of being so close to the truth without being a part of it. The hotel lobby was quiet, almost eerily so. Michael walked through the entrance, his head down, moving quickly to avoid drawing attention. He knew the room number. He had seen it on the camera footage, heard Sarah mention it in one of her phone calls. He didn't need to ask. He knew everything. When he reached the hallway outside their room, Michael stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He could hear the muffled sound of voices. Laughter. Her laughter. The same laughter he hadn't heard in years. The sound pierced him, but not in the way he had expected. It didn't bring pain or anger. It brought a strange sense of release. Standing there, just inches from the door, he realized something he had never fully accepted before. He didn't want to confront Sarah. He didn't want to tear apart their lives, expose the lies, or demand answers. No, what he wanted what he needed was exactly this. To be here, to witness, but never to be seen. To hold the ultimate power of knowledge without the burden of action. For the first time, Michael felt free. Free from the constraints of being a husband, free from the expectations of confronting the truth. He had chosen his role, and it was one that gave him more control than he had ever imagined. He didn't need to stop them. He didn't need to interfere. He was in control by simply knowing, by watching. As the minutes ticked by, Michael stood there, unmoving, listening to the sounds of Sarah and her lover from the other side of the door. He could picture everything in his mind, every touch, every whisper. And in that moment, he realized that this was enough. The power of being invisible, of knowing but not acting there, it was intoxicating. It was everything he had come to crave. When he finally turned to leave, there was no sadness, no anger. Just a quiet satisfaction that settled over him like a blanket. He had become something new, something different, and he had accepted it. As Michael walked out of the hotel and into the cool night air, he felt lighter than he had in years. He no longer needed to be part of their lives in the way he once thought. He was content to watch, to know, to hold the secrets in his hands. And for the first time, he felt in control. Michael sat in his office the next morning, the sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting thin lines of light across his desk. The house was quiet, as it always was this time of day. Sarah had already left, heading off to work, and the kids were at school. It was the perfect moment for reflection, and Michael found himself staring at the black screen of his computer, not quite ready to dive into the surveillance footage just yet. He didn't need to watch anymore. Not like before. The cameras were still there, recording everything in their usual silent manner, but Michael had reached a new level of understanding. He had crossed the threshold between passive observer and something else entirely there, someone who had accepted the role of the unseen. He no longer felt the gnawing curiosity that had driven him to install the cameras in the first place. He didn't need answers because he already had them. The house felt different now, too. What once seemed like a sanctuary, a place where he could relax and be himself, was now more like a stage. And he was the director, controlling the narrative from behind the scenes. He knew when Sarah was lying. He knew when she was planning to meet her lover. He knew everything. But none of that mattered anymore. It wasn't about the affair anymore. It wasn't about the lies, the betrayal, or the secrets. Those things had lost their sting long ago. What mattered was the control he now felt, the control over his own emotions, over the situation, over his life. Watching had become less about Sarah and her actions, and more about the strange sense of power he got from simply knowing. That night at the hotel had been a turning point. He had stood there, just feet away from his wife and her lover, and felt nothing but calm. He had walked away not because he was afraid of what he might do, but because he didn't need to do anything. By choosing not to act, he had taken control in a way that neither of them could understand. Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the screen. With a single click, he could bring up the live feed, watch Sarah at work, or even check on her car to see where she was headed after. But the urge wasn't there anymore. He had moved past that. For the first time in what felt like years, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The man he had been the husband who needed answers, who craved confrontation was gone. In his place was someone new, someone who had found a quiet kind of satisfaction in simply being the one who knew everything, without the need to reveal it. Sarah would never know. She would never suspect that every move she made was being watched, analyzed, understood. And that was perhaps the greatest satisfaction of all. Michael held all the power and he didn't need to use it. As the day passed, Michael went through the motions of work, answering emails, attending virtual meetings, but his mind was elsewhere. He knew Sarah would be home later, tired from another long day at work or so she would say. She would kiss him on the cheek, perhaps offer a half-hearted apology for coming home late, and they would go through the familiar dance of pretending everything was normal. But now Michael didn't mind. He had accepted the reality of his life, the role he had chosen to play. The cameras would continue to record, the secrets would continue to unfold, and he would remain in the shadows, watching, knowing, and ultimately, controlling. When Sarah finally came home that evening, Michael was sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey in his hand. She smiled at him, a tired, forced smile, and he returned it, knowing that behind that smile was a world of lies and half-truths. But it didn't bother him. Not anymore. The long day? Ve, he asked, his voice calm, almost indifferent. Yeah, Ve, she replied, setting her purse down on the counter. Ve, just exhausted. Michael nodded, taking a slow sip from his glass. He didn't need to ask where she had been, or who she had been with. He already knew, and that was enough. As Sarah turned to walk upstairs, Michael watched her go, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He had won Ve not by confronting her, not by exposing the affair, but by accepting his new role in their story. He was the observer, the one who knew everything but chose to remain silent. And in that silence, Michael had found peace. Weeks turned into months, and life for Michael settled into a strange kind of routine. The surveillance cameras still ran silently in the background, capturing every moment of Sarah's life when she thought she was alone. But Michael no longer needed to watch them with the same intensity as before. He had reached a point of understanding that transcended the need for constant observation. The winter months crept in and the days grew shorter. Michael found himself spending more time at home, working remotely while Sarah continued her usual routine, leaving early, coming home late, with brief, tired conversations between them. Their marriage had become a comfortable silence, a mutual understanding that neither would speak the truth out loud. One evening, Michael sat by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames flickering across his face as he stared into the distance. The kids were upstairs, playing in their rooms, and Sarah was once again out, working late, but the absence no longer weighed on him as it once had. He had come to terms with the fact that their lives had taken different paths, even if they remained under the same roof. As the fire crackled softly, Michael V's phone buzzed with a notification. It was the security system, alerting him that Sarah's car had left a familiar location. He knew exactly where she had been and where she was headed. He could have opened the app, checked the live feed, but instead he set the phone down without a second thought. It no longer mattered. Michael had come to understand something important in these quiet months of observation. Life wasn't about chasing the truth or confronting lies. It was about control, about finding peace in the choices you made for yourself. He had chosen his path. He had chosen to watch, to know, and to let go. Sarah would return home later that night, as she always did. She would smile, kiss him on the cheek, and they would sit together in the living room, perhaps watch a movie, or talk briefly about the kids. The surface of their life remained the same, but underneath, Michael knew the truth of it all. And that truth, once painful, had become his quiet source of power. The cameras would keep running. The recordings would continue. But Michael no longer needed them the way he once had. They were there, like silent witnesses to a life he had chosen to watch from a distance. But he no longer needed to check them obsessively. He had moved beyond that. As the night deepened, and the house fell into silence, Michael finished his drink and stood up, glancing out the window at the dark street outside. He felt no anger, no bitterness, just the calm acceptance of a man who had found peace in his own way. Sarah would never know the extent of what he had done, what he had seen. She would never know how much control he held over their lives. And Michael had no intention of revealing it. He had no need to. The power he felt came not from exposing the truth, but from quietly holding it close, unseen, untouched. As he turned away from the window and headed upstairs to bed, Michael felt lighter than he had in years. He was no longer the man he once was, no longer the husband who needed answers or confrontation. He had become something else, something freer, more detached, but in control. And in that control, Michael had found his peace.